In Hollywood, there is an unwritten law of survival that every star eventually learns the hard way. You can survive a sex scandal. You can come back from addiction. You can even rebuild a career after public humiliation. But there is one thing you must never do: anger Johnny Carson. For more than 30 years, The Tonight Show was not just a late-night program. It was the gatekeeper of American fame. A single couch that could turn a nobody into a household name overnight, or quietly erase an entire career just as fast when that invitation stopped coming. Johnny Carson didn't need to shout or make public enemies. He didn't issue official bans, memos, or written blacklists. His power was far more dangerous than that because it was invisible. All it took was silence. One sentence whispered to a producer, one name quietly crossed off a list, and suddenly the phone stopped ringing. In Carson's world, punishment was rarely loud or dramatic. It was precise and surgical. If you betrayed his trust, disrespected the people he considered family, insulted the audience's intelligence, or treated The Tonight Show like a stage beneath you, you didn't get a second chance. You didn't get an explanation. You simply ceased to exist. So who were they? The one who owed Johnny Carson everything, yet still dared to betray him after 20 years of loyalty. The gangster singer who stormed into Carson's private dressing room and threatened him with violence. The frauds who sold lies on national television. The arrogant bullies who trampled everyone around them. And even living legends, famous, powerful, and celebrated, whose character had quietly rotted behind the spotlight. Tonight, we're blowing the dust off a top-secret blacklist. Not to glorify Johnny Carson or excuse his power, but to understand a brutal truth about Hollywood. Talent may get you into the chair, but character is the only thing that keeps you there. Before there were threats, egos, or public humiliations, there was betrayal. And no betrayal cut Johnny Carson deeper than the one committed by Joan Rivers. During his 30-year reign over The Tonight Show, thousands of stars passed through Johnny Carson's living room, but only one person was ever treated as family, as a spiritual daughter, as the most likely successor to the throne. That person was Joan Rivers. Their relationship was not just professional. It was emotional, personal, and built on trust that had been reinforced for 2 decades. When Joan Rivers first appeared on the show in the mid-1960 seconds, she was an unknown comedian struggling to survive in a brutal industry. That single appearance changed her life. Johnny Carson laughed so hard, he wiped tears from his eyes and declared on air that she was going to be a star. From that moment on, Johnny didn't just open doors for Joan, he protected her, mentored her, and elevated her. Eventually, he gave her the ultimate privilege: the guest host chair. Whenever Johnny went on vacation, Joan was the only person allowed to sit behind that desk. To the audience, it looked like destiny. To Hollywood, it looked like a coronation in slow motion. What made this bond even more fragile was Johnny Carson's own private history. By that point in his life, Johnny had already lived through painful divorces and personal betrayals that left him deeply suspicious of disloyalty. Trust, once broken, was not something he believed could be repaired. Loyalty was not just a professional expectation for him, it was a moral line, and that is why what happened next was unforgivable in his eyes. In 1986, fearing that NBC might eventually replace her with a younger face, Joan Rivers made a decision that would end everything. Without telling Johnny Carson, without a single private conversation, she secretly signed a contract with the rival Fox network to launch her own late-night show, one that would directly compete with The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson was the last person to know. He didn't hear it from Joan. He didn't hear it from NBC. He found out through the press. To him, that wasn't ambition. That was betrayal. When the news broke, Joan Rivers called Johnny Carson's private number, hoping that 20 years of affection and loyalty would soften the blow. She tried to explain, she tried to justify, but Johnny didn't argue. He didn't shout. His voice was calm, distant, almost unfamiliar. He simply said, "I heard you got your own show. Congratulations." And then the line went dead. No second sentence, no explanation, no goodbye. That phone call was the end. From that moment on, Johnny Carson executed the most brutal punishment he knew how to deliver. Joan Rivers was banned from The Tonight Show for life. Her name was never mentioned again. Her old clips were sealed. Even when her Fox show failed, even when her husband later took his own life under crushing financial pressure, Johnny never broke the silence. For nearly 2 decades, until his death, Joan Rivers simply did not exist in Johnny Carson's world. With him, you could make mistakes. You could fail, but once you betrayed his trust, you were erased forever. If the Joan Rivers story was a tragedy of betrayal, then the case of Wayne Newton played out like a gangster film, loud, volatile, and dangerously close to violence. Known as Mr. Las Vegas, Wayne Newton was a symbol of glitz and bravado, a performer with a soaring voice, immaculate grooming, and an ego carefully polished under casino lights. But that very image made him irresistible bait for Johnny Carson's sharp tongue, and in the early 1980 seconds, Carson turned Newton into a recurring punchline during his opening monologues. Night after night, Johnny mocked Wayne's masculinity, his appearance, even hinting at his sexuality. The studio audience roared with laughter, and from Johnny's chair, it all looked harmless, a king exercising his right to tease. Wayne Newton tried to endure it. He complained quietly to producers. He asked for the jokes to stop, but the monologues continued, sharper and more humiliating each time. What Johnny underestimated was not Wayne's pride, but his temper. Behind the sequins and stage smiles was a man who did not know how to lose face. One afternoon, after hearing yet another jab on national television, Wayne Newton decided to confront the problem his own way. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call a manager. He drove straight to NBC Studios in Burbank, used his fame to bypass security, and walked uninvited into the sacred backstage area, Johnny Carson's dressing room. Carson was inside, preparing for that night's show, when the door burst open. Wayne Newton entered without a smile, without pleasantries, and according to later accounts, grabbed Johnny by the lapels, pinning the king of late night to his chair. Looking Johnny Carson in the eyes, Wayne Newton issued a direct threat. If the jokes didn't stop, he said, he wouldn't sue. He would beat Johnny Carson in front of everyone. It was a moment unlike anything Carson had experienced in his career. Faced with raw, physical aggression, Johnny did something rare. He backed down. He nodded. Wayne Newton released him, straightened his jacket, and walked out as coldly as he had entered. On the surface, Wayne Newton had won, but the real verdict came later. Johnny Carson never mentioned Wayne Newton's name again. No jokes, no invitations, no acknowledgement. The laughter stopped, and so did the exposure. Wayne Newton was never welcomed back onto The Tonight Show. There was no announcement, no confrontation, just erasure. For an entertainer whose fame depended on national television, that silence was devastating. Wayne Newton had learned the hardest lesson of Carson's world. You could threaten the man, but you could never threaten the throne. Violence might win a moment, but media power decided the rest of your career. If the Joan Rivers story was about betrayal and the Wayne Newton incident involved open confrontation, then the case of Chevy Chase became Johnny Carson's clearest moral lesson about attitude. In the mid-1970 seconds, Chevy Chase arrived at NBC riding a wave of fame from Saturday Night Live, carrying himself not like a guest, but like a young prince entering a palace he believed already belonged to him. From the moment he stepped backstage at The Tonight Show, problems began to surface. Chevy openly disrespected crew members, shouted at makeup artists, mocked assistants, and treated the people behind the scenes as if they were invisible. For Johnny Carson, this behavior crossed an unforgivable line. He considered the production crew his extended family, famously treating the cable puller with the same respect he gave a United States senator. As complaints about Chevy Chase's arrogant behavior piled up, Johnny Carson didn't explode in anger. He didn't confront Chevy directly. Instead, something far more dangerous happened. Johnny began quietly crossing Chevy's name off in his mind. What made the situation worse was that Chevy's arrogance didn't stop backstage. It followed him straight onto the air. Sitting opposite Johnny Carson, Chevy often leaned back with his legs casually propped up, wearing a smug expression that suggested boredom rather than gratitude. He gave curt, dismissive answers, interrupted Johnny's rhythm, and deliberately disrupted the flow of the interview as if to prove that he was smarter than the host. Unlike legends such as Bob Hope or Frank Sinatra, who always approached Johnny Carson with humility no matter how powerful they were, Chevy Chase behaved as if his presence on The Tonight Show was a favor granted to the program. He treated the chair not as an honor, but as an entitlement. The tension was visible. And then came the final straw. Chevy Chase's humor crossed from arrogance into cruelty. He routinely mocked the appearance, weight, and failures of other colleagues, using humiliation as a shortcut to laughter. Johnny Carson was a master of comedy, but he never accepted humor that trampled on someone else's pain. Johnny Carson didn't need a loud argument like he had with Wayne Newton. He didn't need to embarrass Chevy on air. The punishment he chose was far colder. Quietly, calmly, he told producer Fred DeCordova that he didn't want to see Chevy Chase on the show anymore. There was no announcement, no formal ban, just silence. From that moment on, the doors of The Tonight Show closed. While other comedians of the era became regular guests and saw their careers soar thanks to Johnny's platform, Chevy Chase's appearances stopped completely. In Carson's kingdom, this silent punishment was devastating. It sent a message the entire industry understood without a single word being spoken. Talent might open the door, but character decides whether it ever opens again. The case of Jim Garrison was different from everything that came before it. There was no betrayal of loyalty, no backstage arrogance, and no threat of violence. What Jim Garrison violated was something Johnny Carson valued just as deeply: the intelligence of the audience. In the late 1960 seconds, America was still reeling from the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a national wound that had never healed. Into that atmosphere of confusion and grief stepped Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney who claimed he possessed shocking evidence of a hidden conspiracy behind the murder. Curious and genuinely interested in the truth, Johnny Carson made a rare decision. He broke the unspoken rule of avoiding heavy political controversy and invited Garrison onto The Tonight Show on the 31st of January 1968, giving him unusually generous airtime to present his case. What Carson expected was clarity, facts, and credible evidence. What he received was something else entirely. As the interview unfolded, Garrison failed to present solid proof. Instead, he relied on blurry photographs, vague accusations, and loosely connected theories aimed at government officials. Each time, Johnny asked a direct question: "What is your evidence? Who exactly are you accusing?" Garrison dodged, rambled, and redirected. Very quickly, Johnny Carson realized what was happening. Garrison wasn't there to seek justice for JFK. He was using America's biggest television platform to sell fear, promote his books, and inflate his own importance. Worse still, he spoke as if the audience would accept anything so long as it was delivered with confidence and drama. To Johnny Carson, this was unforgivable. He believed his viewers were sharp, thoughtful, and deserving of honesty. Treating them like fools crossed a moral line. On air, Carson shifted from host to prosecutor. He interrupted Garrison, pointed out contradictions, and exposed the holes in his arguments in real time. As the pressure mounted, Garrison began to sweat, stumble, and lose control of his narrative. The illusion collapsed live on television. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, Johnny Carson was furious not because the interview failed, but because he felt used to spread unverified claims about a murdered president, used to legitimize a man he now saw as a charlatan. The verdict came immediately. Johnny Carson turned to his producers and made his decision unmistakably clear: Jim Garrison was never to be invited back. There was no second appearance, no chance at redemption. The door slammed shut permanently. Garrison continued to appear elsewhere, but the most prestigious platform in American television was closed to him forever. In Carson's world, deceiving the audience was a crime worse than arrogance. Once you crossed that line, you didn't just lose access, you lost credibility. Among everyone who ever crossed Johnny Carson, the case of Yuri Geller was uniquely personal. There was no betrayal of loyalty, no backstage arrogance, and no threat of violence. What Yuri Geller violated was something deeply rooted in Johnny Carson's identity long before he became a television king: respect for the craft of illusion and the intelligence of the audience. Few people remembered that before Carson ruled late night, he had been a young magician himself, performing under the stage name The Great Carson. He loved skill, preparation, and honest misdirection. What he despised were frauds who sold tricks as supernatural truth. In the early 1970s, Yuri Geller was a global phenomenon. He claimed to bend spoons with his mind, repair broken watches using psychic energy, and read drawings sealed inside envelopes. Audiences around the world believed him, and many television hosts treated him like a miracle. Johnny Carson did not. When Geller was booked on The Tonight Show in 1973, Carson prepared carefully not to humiliate a guest, but to protect the audience. Before the taping, Carson consulted professional skeptics and magicians and made a simple decision. All props would be supplied by the show, untouched and closely supervised. When the cameras rolled, the trap quietly closed. Geller stepped onto the stage, confident, smiling, ready to perform. But as soon as he saw the table of brand new spoons, sealed envelopes, and controlled materials, something changed. He struggled immediately. He rubbed the spoons. He concentrated. Nothing bent. He attempted to read the drawings. He failed again. Sweat appeared. Excuses followed. He blamed pressure. He blamed weak energy. He blamed the atmosphere. Johnny Carson did nothing to help him. He didn't crack jokes to soften the moment. He didn't rescue the performance. He leaned back in his chair and let the silence work. For more than 20 minutes, America watched a man who claimed supernatural power lose it completely when stripped of preparation. The camera lingered. The pauses stretched. The illusion collapsed in real time. Carson's calm was devastating. He didn't accuse. He didn't argue. He simply waited. That night destroyed Yuri Geller's credibility with anyone paying attention. Carson never needed to ban him publicly. He never invited him back. The verdict was permanent and unspoken. In Johnny Carson's world, deceiving the audience was not entertainment, it was a moral offense. And when someone crossed that line, Carson didn't fight them. He exposed them, silently, and let the truth do the rest. The case of Milton Berle was not about betrayal, cruelty, or deception. It was about ego and the inability to accept that the crown had already passed. Long before Johnny Carson ruled late night, Milton Berle had been America's first true television king, the man whose popularity in the 1,950 seconds was so overwhelming that families bought television sets just to watch him perform. On paper, his appearances on The Tonight Show should have represented a respectful meeting between two generations. In reality, they became a slow, exhausting struggle for control that pushed Johnny Carson to his limits. Milton Berle arrived at NBC carrying the habits of an old monarch who never learned how to be a guest. He was loud, overpowering, and obsessed with attention. But what truly drove Johnny Carson insane was Berle's constant hijacking of the forum. Whenever Johnny tried to speak or interview another guest, Berle refused to sit still. He pulled faces, winked at the audience, pretended to fall out of his chair, or interrupted with stale jokes designed solely to drag the spotlight back to himself. In Berle's mind, Johnny Carson wasn't the host of the show. He was merely a straight man, a supporting assistant for Milton Berle's solo performance. The disrespect didn't stop there. One of the small details that enraged Johnny Carson the most was Berle's cigar. Milton Berle frequently appeared on set with a thick cigar clenched between his fingers or lips, smoking continuously despite Johnny's visible discomfort. He blew heavy clouds of smoke into the air, filling the studio while Johnny frowned, coughed lightly, and shifted in his chair. Carson valued cleanliness, control, and personal boundaries. Berle treated the set like his private nightclub, ignoring every nonverbal signal to stop. There was also one immutable rule Johnny Carson never tolerated being broken: do not touch him. Johnny fiercely guarded his personal space, but Milton Berle, emboldened by his past status, crossed that line repeatedly. He patted Johnny's shoulder, slapped his thigh, poked him mid-sentence to emphasize jokes, and leaned into his space without permission. Each time, attentive viewers could see Johnny's body stiffen, his smile tighten, and irritation flash across his face. What made it worse was Burle's habit of correcting Johnny on air, criticizing the script, interrupting punchlines, and behaving as if he were still the man running NBC. After every taping, Johnny Carson returned to his dressing room drained and furious. He complained to producer Fred de Cordova that Milton Berle sucked all the air out of the room. Out of respect for Burle's legendary status, Johnny never issued a public ban. There was no confrontation and no dramatic fallout. Instead, Carson chose the punishment he trusted most. Invitations became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. Milton Berle wasn't erased overnight, but he was quietly frozen out. In Johnny Carson's kingdom, even legends were guests, and guests who refused to respect the house eventually found the door closed. If Milton Berle exhausted Johnny Carson with noise and ego, the appearance of Raymond Burr tortured him with something far worse: silence. To television audiences of the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, Raymond Burr was the embodiment of authority and intelligence, the brilliant lawyer who never lost a case on Perry Mason and the sharp-minded detective of Ironside. When NBC announced his appearance on The Tonight Show, viewers expected wit, stories, and insight. What Johnny Carson received instead was a masterclass in dead air. From the moment Raymond Burr sat down, the oxygen seemed to drain from the studio. Johnny Carson, armed with decades of conversational instinct, threw out open-ended questions and gentle jokes, trying to spark a rhythm. Burr gave nothing back. His answers were curt to the point of cruelty. Yes, no, I don't think so. When Johnny asked about the challenge of playing a character in a wheelchair, Burr replied simply, no, and stopped. Silence followed. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Johnny tried again, steering toward Burr's private life, his interests, his off-camera personality. Burr stared back and said, I grow orchids. Full stop. For a talk show host, dead air is the enemy. Johnny Carson felt it closing in. He tapped his pencil, glanced toward Ed McMahon for rescue, and even joked about his own failure to get a laugh, desperately trying to keep the conversation alive. It felt less like an interview and more like pulling teeth. Raymond Burr wasn't rude. He wasn't arrogant. He simply refused or was unable to play the television game. The wall never cracked. The ball never came back. When the segment finally ended and Burr exited the stage, Johnny Carson collapsed onto his desk and pretended to faint, a gag that drew laughter but masked real relief. Behind the joke was a message to the production team. This cannot happen again. Burr was never officially banned. There was no moral judgment and no personal animosity. But in Johnny Carson's world, entertainment was not optional. If you couldn't connect, you didn't belong in the chair. Raymond Burr was quietly crossed off the priority list, not for who he was, but for what he could not give. By the time Ryan O'Neal walked onto the Tonight Show stage in the 1,970 seconds, he wasn't just a movie star, he was Hollywood royalty. After the massive success of Love Story, Ryan O'Neal became the golden boy of American cinema, adored by audiences and pursued relentlessly by studios. When NBC announced his appearance, the studio audience expected charm, warmth, and effortless charisma. What Johnny Carson felt instead was something colder, indifference wrapped in arrogance. From the moment Ryan sat down, it was clear he didn't want to be there. He slouched into the chair, stretched out, and treated the interview not as a conversation, but as a chore. Johnny asked about his latest film, his creative process, his experiences in Hollywood. Ryan answered with shrugs, vague phrases, and dismissive tones. It's fine, nothing special, just another movie. He avoided eye contact, scanned the studio as if searching for an exit, and made it painfully obvious that he believed television talk shows were beneath him. What irritated Johnny Carson most wasn't silence. He had endured that before, but disrespect. Ryan O'Neal didn't listen. He waited. He stared at monitors, adjusted his collar, admired his reflection, and treated Johnny's questions like interruptions. Johnny prided himself on preparation and rhythm. He respected the craft of conversation. Sitting across from Ryan felt like trying to entertain someone who had already decided the room wasn't worth his time. Unlike Raymond Burr's awkward reserve, Ryan O'Neill's coldness came from entitlement. He radiated the unspoken message that his presence alone was a favor. For Johnny Carson, that was an insult delivered inside his own house. After the taping ended, there was no argument and no dramatic ban. Johnny simply expressed his exhaustion to the production team. If he doesn't want to be here, don't invite him back. Ryan O'Neill's appearances on The Tonight Show became rare, then non-existent. As the years passed and his film career cooled amid personal scandals and an increasingly difficult reputation, the door never reopened. In Carson's world, fame did not excuse contempt. Talent might bring you to the couch once, but respect was the only thing that earned a return. 8 names, 8 different mistakes, and 8 careers that all learned the same lesson far too late. Johnny Carson never needed to raise his voice, issue public bans, or humiliate people on air to prove his power. His authority came from something far colder, the ability to decide who existed and who didn't. In a town built on attention, silence was the ultimate weapon. Some betrayed his trust, some disrespected his home, some insulted the intelligence of the audience, others simply believed their fame made them untouchable. But in Johnny Carson's world, none of that mattered. Talent could open the door once, fame could buy you a seat for a night, but character was the only thing that earned a return invitation. The Tonight Show was never just a couch, it was a test. A place where egos were exposed, masks slipped, and every guest was measured not by how famous they were, but by how they behaved when the spotlight wasn't theirs. And when someone failed that test, the punishment wasn't loud, it was permanent. So the real question isn't why Johnny Carson banned them, it's how many others disappeared without anyone ever knowing why. How many careers ended not with a scandal, but with a phone that simply stopped ringing. If you were in Hollywood back then, one rule mattered above all others. You didn't just need to be good, you needed to know how to sit in the chair. What do you think? Was Johnny Carson protecting his show or abusing unchecked power? Were these bans justified, or were they acts of quiet cruelty? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep digging into Hollywood's most carefully buried secrets, make sure to subscribe.